My name is Mudima Fantire. I'm a Research and Policy Officer at the Climate Action Network South Africa, and I'll be facilitating this highly anticipated toolkit launch today. This webinar is proudly brought to you by the Climate Action to Accountability Project, a partnership between the WWF South Africa, the Institute for Economic Justice, and the Climate Action Network South Africa, co-founded by the EU and CEDA, along with the New Economy Hub at the African Climate Foundation. The launch of this toolkit is really a result of many years, in fact, and not just months of hard work led by the Institute for Economic Justice, who will be presenting today, along with our reference group members who have co-created and co-developed this toolkit. The aim of the toolkit is to empower CSOs and campaigners on matters relating to climate finance, and really to advance a rights-based approach to climate investment plans for developing nations to realize a just transition. We hope that during the session, you'll be able to participate in the chat, ask some questions, and more than anything, engage with the toolkit. I'll hand over to Yasira and Vasani, who have led on this work. Over to you, Yasira and Vasani.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Is it good afternoon? Thank you very much. I think Yasira it will be a joint presentation between myself and Yasira. So we'll be playing musical chairs. The purpose of this toolkit is to, you can go to the next slide. The purpose of this toolkit is to empower civil society and trade union organizations to effectively influence the climate finance policy agenda in the energy transitions through a rights-based approach to climate finance that points out manageable interventions that workers and civil society organizations may be able to campaign for. The toolkit identifies the core principles of human rights-based approach to climate finance. These principles are drawn from international agreements that states are obligated towards. Examples are international human rights agreements, the guiding principles on foreign debt and human rights, and international climate agreements. We then arrange these principles into 6 clusters, and these principles were actually tested out and approved by our reference group that was made up of civil society and trade union organizations. We then demonstrate how civil society and trade unions can advocate for governments to implement 5 of these clusters through a set of fact sheets designed to build knowledge and broaden understanding, how-to guides which provide practical approaches to advocacy, and we also have call to actions. The toolkit is written so that you can pick and choose the advocacy ideas your organization wants to pursue, and of course, these can be revised and adapted to suit your needs. The major takeaway points of this toolkit is that progressive climate finance pathways exist that create, first of all, a fiscal space for climate and just transition action without compelling countries to take up undue debt. Climate finance pathways also exist that are aligned to climate ambitions, and then climate finance pathways exist that are responsive to the developmental needs of developing countries. Over to you, Yasir.
Cool. So me and Vasani are just going to be going back and forth between these slides. But yeah, I just wanted, this slide really represents what Vasani was talking about the clusters that we developed and looked at in order to guide and provide a framework for this toolkits. And part of this is that we base the toolkit on the fact that that countries need to meet climate goals while still being able to fulfill and realize their human rights. And there's a gap between what internationally agreed upon principles should guide financing, climate and development, and the actual policy practices that happen on the ground and typically undermine human rights. And so CSOs and trade unions need to be capacitated on this gap and sort of know what the advocacy instruments and identify leveraging points to overcome this. So when we asked ourselves, what are the internationally agreed upon rights-based principles that guide climate financing and development, we came up with 3 main documents that we wanted to source from. The first one was the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The second one was on, because this is a document, the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights is an international agreement that sort of guides states' obligation to finance right realization. The second one is on the UN Guiding Principles of Foreign Debt and Human Rights. And this is because so much of climate finance may come in as debt. And lastly, we use the very international obligations such as the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC Agreement. And we extracted from those 3, and we came up with these principles that we have here. We dedicated 13 focal points, but we grouped them into 5 clusters. So just briefly to go through them, the first cluster is national responsibilities. So this indicates what states are obliged to finance. So the main principles here are that states are required to ensure that financing is consistent with climate goals. So development financing must be consistent with climate goals, that states are mobilizing the maximum amount of available resources towards rights realization, and that they're meeting a minimum level of rights realization even during crisis, such as the climate crisis. And that's what states are obliged to do. The second cluster is obligations to others, and the key focus that we looked at here was technological transfer. So what obligations do states have to each other? And this was states have an obligation to transfer key climate technologies to help each other adapt to the crisis without gatekeeping any of that information. The third cluster is maintaining national sovereignty, which means that to have an independent process of development and an independent climate trajectory without any influence from others. And then the fourth one is states are responsible for the responsibilities of financial flows. So how should financial flows be managed? And some of this is like debt sustainability assessments to ensure that debt is not burdensome, that financing, when climate financing comes in, it's new, it's additional, it's full and agreed, so what is actually needed, and that it's predictable, it comes in a predictable manner. And then the last cluster is on times of crisis, and this is ensuring that during times of crisis, there are safety mechanisms to ensure certain things. For example, that states are not overburdened by debt repayments and are instead focusing on financing social needs. So that's briefly the framework that we came up with. And I think we'll go somewhat into these principles, and this is how the toolkit is sort of ordered. For now, we're going to look at things according to those key messages that Basani mentioned, and speak to that. So I'll hand over to Basani to go from the first key message.
So thank you very much. So in terms of the first key message which is that fiscal space for climate and just transition action without undue debt. So the JETP and other kinds of climate financing deals are mobilizing public sector debt in particular in order to mobilize commercial sector debt through a process called de-risking. And they believe by doing that, we're going to get trillions of dollars of private finance money. However, this may cause future sovereign debt crisis, more especially under the current global financial architecture. These sovereign debt crises will deepen climate and social crises as governments are forced to enact inhumane austerity measures. The toolkit outlines instruments that may help to create fiscal space around which advocacy can be built. These are green monetary policy instruments, cap and share tax method that is proposed by the Cap and Share Alliance, the climate responsive budgeting, debt workout mechanism, and also progressive debt sustainability assessment. Now, this presentation will not focus on all these methods. The toolkit is quite comprehensive. So we are just going to focus on the debt workout mechanism. Please turn to the next slide. Now, debt is not bad per se, but it becomes bad in a wild, wild west like global sovereign debt architecture that we find ourselves in, that has not really figured out how to deal with debt distress and debt crises in a manner that is restorative and helps to realize human rights. Currently, there's no overarching body of rules to regulate sovereign borrowing, and by that I mean state borrowing or lending, that is regulated by an inclusive, transparent, or democratically governed body, like, for instance, the UN. What currently exists is a regime that is poorly governed by rich clubs that are formed by governments or groups of countries, like the Paris Club of OECD countries, or the informal group of 20, or more popularly known as the G20, right? And also a patchwork of domestic laws. Next slide. Next slide, please. So climate, social, and economic justice campaigners have been calling for debt cancellation as one of the primary cause of climate action and basically social justice action. Indeed, debt cancellation is vital to create the fiscal space that is required for countries to create or to meet their socioeconomic and climate ambitions. However, the lessons that have been learned from other previous processes, such as the heavily indebted poor country initiative and the now current common framework, is that debt cancellation in a patchy international sovereign debt architecture, right, that is anarchic and chaotic, is unsustainable as a standalone demand. Private debtors, these commercial debtors, are often reluctant to participate in these types of debt restructuring processes. Countries are expected to pay their debt even when there are long protracted negotiations that would be taking place. This is the case of Ghana and Zambia. And the instruments that are used to assess their debt usually prioritize servicing their debt over and above balancing this with human rights and SDG considerations. And finally, there are no automatic or temporary financing mechanisms that can help in acute crises for people to access while negotiations are proceeding. So what usually happens is that countries who are suffering from debt distress would rather not go through these processes and then enact austerity themselves, right? Because they just don't trust these processes. Indeed, so because of this, there is this need then for some kind of a debt workout mechanism that can ensure that human rights and SDGs are maintained. So the toolkit outlines UNCTAD's progressive debt workout mechanism, right, that maintains human rights and SDGs. We therefore have a call to action that draws from this debt workout mechanism to ensure that these are maintained. And this debt workout mechanism proposes 5 principles that address the deficiencies in the current regime, such as transparency, sustainability, legitimacy, impartiality, and good faith. I can go more into that in the questions and answers. The establishment of a UN treaty body that supports individual debtor countries, discourage uncooperative predator behavior, and also immediate debt standstills in acute finance when countries are in debt crisis, so that they can actually continue in their negotiations, right? And then debt sustainability assessments that include economic, social, and climate recovery programs as part of their assessments. I will now hand over to you, Yasira.
Thanks, Basani. So I'll then explore the second key message that we wanted people to get out of this toolkit, which is that climate finance needs to be aligned to climate ambitions and the just transition. So to contextualize the situation a bit, South Africa has received 11.3 billion of committed finance through the JET-P, or the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and it has pledged to raise a total of 1.5 trillion rand by 2027 as part of the larger Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. But when we look at these investment plans and what's been invested, they do not seem to be directed towards the national determined contributions. So, for example, the JET-P aims to finance three things: so energy, transport, and green hydrogen. But in all three cases, there's sort of a misalignment with climate goals. So firstly, the electrification plan is solely reliant on private renewable energy generation, which this toolkit explores fails to secure the sufficient scale of energy production. Secondly, the planned transportation investment undervalues the need of shifting to a more sustainable system of public transport and heavily focuses on subsidizing private ownership of new energy vehicles or electric vehicles. And this is contrary to what we have in our NDCs, or the decarbonization plan we have for transportation. And then thirdly, the green hydrogen industrialization plan is highly ambitious and very risky, with little resourcing or security in its viability. And ultimately, altogether, committed financing dedicated to social outcomes make up less than 1% of the entire investment plan. So so we can see that NDCs are not prioritized, and it's important to analyze and correct the misalignment between NDCs and the just transition objectives on the one hand, and the climate finance investment plans on the other hand. And this is to ensure that adequate funding is being allocated to meet climate goals and the just transition objectives in the short and medium term. And so there's multiple ways to assess and to keep track of whether we are on board with the NDCs, like ensuring that investment plans are transparent and accountable. But one way that we wanted to go into right now, one example from the toolkit is the progressive and multi-stakeholder climate responsive budgeting process that incorporates social, gender, and transitional risks. So climate responsive budgeting is a methodology for mainstreaming climate policies through a country's national budget cycle. And the toolkit looks at three methodologies that are in wide use. The first one is the climate budget tagging, and the South African National Treasury is currently developing a climate tagging approach. I think it's been tested out in some municipalities. And it follows in the footsteps of pioneers in the Asian Pacific region. And what this approach does is it identifies, monitors, and reports on climate-related expenditure in the budgetary process. And an assessment of this process will reveal that it helps to mobilize adequate funding. But a downfall of it is it fails to mobilize green revenue and fails to align with climate goals. So it just tags the process and it doesn't assess or analyze beyond that. So an improvement on that is then green budgeting. And it assesses the greenness of budgetary expenditure and revenue at national and local levels. So it's a comprehensive budgetary process that aims to improve the alignment between fiscal policy and environmental and climate goals. So examples, you could use climate budget tagging and environmental taxation and environmental impacts assessment. So you can see where the money is coming from, where it's going. But then you can even have one up on that, which is the green fiscal policy. And this is this includes the full scope of a fiscal policy. So it's not just revenue and expenditure, but revenues, expenditure, borrowing, and all environmental domains. So mitigation, adaptation, pollution prevention, and biodiversity. And it addresses this two-way interaction between the impacts of fiscal policy on climate change and the environment, and then vice versa. So the questions that can be asked when you're looking at green fiscal policy with respect and how it can contest the fiscal impacts on the environment, you could ask, how much should government spend on fossil fuels compared with its expenditure on climate action? And the questions that it can ask in reverse, so that green fiscal policy can contest in climate change, is what are the relative fiscal costs of mitigation or adaptation through renewable energy infrastructure versus the fiscal cost of fossil fuel infrastructure on climate change. So it can get us to think a bit deeper on the full scale, the full fiscal scale. Yeah, and much of the policy development discourse on climate responsive budgeting centers around the alignment of government expenditure and investment with climate goals, given the transitional and social risks associated with the decarbonization agenda. So it'll be important to ensure that other social dimensions are included in the budget process that give rise to the realization of human rights to achieve a just transition. So to ensure that climate responsive budgeting is gender responsive and addresses distributional impacts of the transition and climate change on vulnerable communities, we can include things like gender responsive budgeting, or vulnerability, loss and damage assessments, or fiscal incident analysis that can address the full scale of where our budget is going. And yeah, South Africa can apply an open climate green budgeting approach, and its macro fiscal budget processes have already been lauded as the most transparent in the world. But budget justice campaigners complain that their influence on the budget process is constrained by being late to the development process. So currently, civil society and trade union organizations in South Africa are not part of the National Treasury climate responsive budgeting process at this beginning stage, at the formulation of it, as they should be. So the toolkit sort of gives a how-to guide and it extracts a lot from the International Budget Partnership Conceptual Framework. And it lists like 16 components of climate-sensitive components for multi-stakeholder climate responsive budgeting review process. And we adapted so that it includes the just energy transition concerns as well. And transparency requirements that civil society, trade unions, and parliament must demand and make these actors accountable in order to foster this multi-stakeholder monitoring and evaluation of climate responsive budgeting progress and to influence the outcomes of the process. So yeah, that is climate responsive budgeting. And that's the work that we've been doing. But I'll now hand over back to Basani to talk about the third key message.
Thank you, Yasira. Yes. So the third key message is around climate finance must be responsive to the developmental needs of developing countries. So climate finance should align with the government's rights-based responsibility to meet essential rights and essential services, right? And these are economic and social and cultural rights such as healthcare, housing, education, food, energy, and water. And this must be done even in situations of resource constraints. This is a key principle under the predicted climate disaster events. However, climate finance deals heavily focused. Sorry about that. That's my mother. Sorry about that. However, climate finance deals that are heavily focused on public-private partnerships and defunding public provisioning could create inequalities of access to climate public goods. The toolkit proposes the following instruments that we champion to ensure climate finance is actually responsive. Excuse me. Pardon me. Sorry about that. The toolkit proposes the following instruments we champion to ensure climate finance is responsive to the developmental needs of developing countries. We assess and make proposals on the regulations of public-private partnerships that have been developed by National Treasury and how to exercise oversight over state-owned enterprises. For this presentation, we'll focus our considerations on the regulatory oversight of public-private partnerships. Next slide, please. So the South African National Treasury has developed these regulations called Regulation 16.4 that provides for feasibility studies to be conducted to assess the viability of a public-private partnership project. The provision compels the state entity to assess the viability of these PPPs that they want to have based on 3 types of criteria. The first is whether or not the entity can afford the project, right? The second is the value for money of the project. And then the third is the extent to which risks are being transferred from the public sector to the private sector. So this idea of risk transfer, and this idea of risk transfer is actually at the core of what makes PPPs something that governments want to do, at least the supposed risk transfer. The regulations, however, does not disclose the method that is to be used to make these assessments. The feasibility assessment method is outlined in National Treasury Guidelines PPP Practice Note, which uses a public sector comparator method. And this PSC approach is meant to be used by government entities to establish whether or not they should go ahead with a PPP option or do a public provision option. Now, we have identified several challenges with the regulations and the guidelines. The first is that the regulations do not provide for public consultations about the outcomes of the feasibility assessment. Second, the state entity decides on the assessment mechanisms as regulations don't specify an appropriate method. Lastly, and crucially, Annexure 4, which outlines the risks of PPPs, either misspecifies and or omits key risks of PPPs. The end result is that the guidelines are falsely and dubiously framed in a way which suggests that the risks of service provision are transferred from the public sector to the private sector as a way of making these PPPs bankable. Therefore, it unduly favors the private sector option over the public sector option. So some of these risks that are either misspecified or omitted are risks such as the bankruptcy risk, the demand risk, and then social and human rights risks are absent, and then in the renegotiation risks, should crisis happen and you need to renegotiate with whomever you contracted out, that usually comes at great cost, and those risks are not part of the risk matrix. I can go into each one specifically in the Q&A. Now, it is crucial that the true costs of PPPs are weighed up against the public provision, as it has been found that they can cost more than double of the total financing from bank loans or bonds, even for developed countries. Yet the IMF and World Bank's current debt sustainability framework, which the Toolkit also discusses and proposes advocacy for, fails to account for the cost of PPPs, leaving the general public unaware of the true fiscal risks their governments are facing. Next slide, please. So the Toolkit proposes a call to action on basically ensuring a more improved oversight of PPPs, on regulatory oversight of PPPs. And this call to action is for CSOs which want to demand regulations that ensure that public provisioning is not unduly prejudiced by PPP regulations and guidelines in favor of PPPs. And that the process of decision-making in public service provisioning is actually democratized. So we want regulatory provisions to be put in place to compel state entities to use appropriate assessment methods to ensure that public provision is not unduly prejudiced in favor of PPPs, and that the findings of assessments are opened up for public consultation before being considered for approval, and also to improve the life cycle cost comparison, which looks at the costs of PPPs versus a public auction over the lifetime of a project, right? We want this improved, these types of comparisons to be improved, to ensure that a realistic cost comparison is actually achieved. And the comparison must take into account the transfer of bankruptcy and demand risk to the state that often happens in the process. And also it must include social and human rights risks and renegotiations. And we also want that these PPP contracts, because they have direct implications on communities, to be actually made public for the sake of accountability and risk oversight. I hand over to you, Yasira.
Thank you, Basani. So I'm just going to have a final input on the same key message, which is that climate finance should be responsive to the development needs of the country. And we just want to talk a little bit about IFIs, or international finance institutions, such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, New Development Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And these IFIs play a role in the economic development and structural change of countries around the world by lending during recessions and providing long-term capital for development projects, and making venture capital injections into high-risk innovation, research and development, and promoting mission-oriented investments. And recently, we have seen that IFIs have started delivering these messages in response to climate emergencies. So, for example, the European Investment Bank contributed 1 billion euros to support Indonesia's JETB, and the African Development Bank, the KfW, and the European Investment Bank committed 2.2 billion sovereign loans to support South Africa's JETIP. But we can see from examples, so from COVID-19, the 19 pandemic, it demonstrated how these international financial institutions structure conditionalities on the loans that they give. So, which effectively leads to the loss of control over the policy space and democratic ownership of the development of a country. And so what are conditionalities? Conditionalities are requirements imposed on countries in order to access IFI loans. So in order to have these loans, these are the conditions, but they usually require legal and neoliberal policy changes. So for example, things like trade liberalization to make a country more attractive to foreign investors by removing restrictions on the exchange of the goods, currency liberalization to allow market forces to determine the value of the currency, removal of capital controls to allow greater movement of funds in and out of the country, so usually benefiting one of the parties. And these things have been employed as forms of soft power to restrict a country's policy space due to the binding nature of what they now call, they've changed the name to, I think, call it now prior actions. Before you get prior actions, before you allow this loan. And this allows the World Bank to sort of influence national policies and limit the autonomy of the country. So autonomous decision-making and development trajectory. So yeah, that we wanted to briefly mention that this is something and that we've discussed in depth in the toolkit, and we talk a bit about what is needed. We have a how-to guide on the process. So there needs to be parliamentary oversight over these international financial institution loan conditionalities to ensure that they do not skew budgets or policies or harm the environment and society at large. And oversight can be exercised through formal or informal parliamentary briefings or consultations or legislations, and steps that CSOs or civil society organizations and trade unions can take to advocate for parliamentary oversight. Firstly, we can work through the independent financial service tribunals. This is very applicable to the South African case. Secondly, we can build coalition-based campaigns. Thirdly, we can establish frameworks for legal parliamentary oversight. We can reinforce existing legal frameworks to avoid executive bypass. We can demand a structural parliamentary engagement process, and we can also demand effective parliamentary involvement in macroeconomic surveillance and development policy financing consultations. Yeah. So that is just a little bit of IFS, but it's talked about much more in depth in the actual toolkit. I will hand over to Basani to just say some thanks before we move on with the program.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I mean, we've given you snippets of the toolkit. There's quite a lot that we cover, and so can't go into the details. The toolkit is on the IAJ website for those of you who are interested. Yeah, it's quite a read. And then we do implore you to basically focus in on the sections that are most relevant to your organization. But what we did want to do is thank our wonderful reference group that really supported us in the development of this project. The names of them and their organizations are listed there, and some of them have actually endorsed, actually most of them have endorsed the toolkit. And then also to just thank the project team that was involved in the direct development of the toolkit as well. Last slide. Now, in terms of the next steps, these and other topics on progressive climate financing regimes will be unpacked as part of an exciting 2-day training workshop for civil society organizations and trade unions that is taking place in Johannesburg and Cape Town. The workshop will create opportunities for participants to share their experiences, their insights, and best practices through an interactive and participatory learning method to facilitate knowledge exchange, mutual learning, and solidarity. We are being actually coached by a specialized trainer to make sure that this is a very engaging training. So we do, for those of you who would be interested in this training, please, we will, I suppose, contact those who are here, and please do let us know. And yes, so they will be taking place. The first one will be taking place in Johannesburg next week, and then the other one will be taking place in Cape Town the following week. Funding, if we receive more funding, we'll be able to do more of these types of trainings going forward. And what we want to have to achieve with this toolkit is to make it a living document where you know, we get feedback, and it's something that we can revise as we continue forward. So please also think about it in that way. And yeah, and just to thank you. I hand over to you, Mo.
Thank you so much for that, Basani and Yasira. You've really taken us through the complex and very widespread and quite difficult to understand topics explored in the toolkit. But I must say that the strength of the toolkit is that it's broken up into different elements that will allow you to engage with it maybe at your own pace. So there are how-to guides, there are fact sheets, and there are individual chapters. We're moving on to our panel discussion made up of the reference group members that Basani mentioned. So first up, we will be having an input from Courtney Morgan, who is a campaigner at the African Climate Reality Project. On this panel, she's representing the Fair Finance Coalition of South Africa. She'll be taking us through section 3 of the toolkit.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for having us and including us in the discussion. So firstly, I think just to cover the takeaways again, for me as a campaigner, someone who's was not necessarily trained in the technical detail of climate finance, but really for me as a campaigner, as someone who works on the ground and works with communities, this is a really, really important discussion for us, because I think in the climate justice movement, we've really moved from, we really shifted, and we now realize that the solutions that we've always demanded need to be financed. And so climate finance is a topic we all need to be able to speak on. But at the same time, as the moderator just mentioned, finance is a topic that has been largely inaccessible, and intentionally complicated, right? Which really excludes the public and civil society from giving meaningful impact when it's something that affects us so directly. So it's really important to understand and to take away from this toolkit that climate finance is not neutral. It has the potential to shape how our transition plays out. It can either enable justice outcomes or it can hinder it. And so we really believe that people need to be able to speak confidently on the issue in order to influence how finance comes into the country and how it is dispersed. Essentially, we feel that finance is too important to be left up to a small group, and that we all need to understand and act on climate finance. And this toolkit, along with others, really help us to do that. So the key takeaway is that finance is not scary. We can all meet finance where we are, and we can all have a say in the financial system. Before I kind of dive into the specific part of the toolkit, I just want to also say, to the authors and to everyone who's involved, that the whole idea of the toolkit serves us as campaigners, which is like super great. The idea of linking a human rights-based approach, a principled approach, to the technical detail is one that supports the work that campaigners are already doing. And the advantage of a human rights-based approach is that it connects us with other struggles. And finance becomes something that's not just this difficult topic to understand, but it actually just becomes a tool to achieve justice within those various struggles with our various tactics. So what I'm going to do in true campaigner fashion is I'm going to use my couple of minutes to actually point out possible tactics. And I know that the toolkit goes into quite a lot of detail around calls to action and campaigns you can kind of get involved in. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through section 3 of the toolkit, which starts on page 19. The link has been shared. The section is the guidelines for a rights-based framework to climate finance. So I'm just going to go through very quick tactics that are used by the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa, but also other organizations. Before I do that, just to explain, how we use principles as campaigners. It's essentially you continue to make your calls to action or your demands, and then principles can be used to supplement the very real on the ground demands that we all have. So for example, I'm calling for ABC because of the principle of this. A principle is not necessarily something that stands alone, but it can be used as part of your existing campaigns and interpreted to appeal to your audiences. So that supports what Basani is saying, that all of us can read specific parts of the toolkit and take what's relevant to our audiences. It just depends what your organization does. And that's really, I think, why the toolkit is so powerful, in my opinion. Specifically, I want to focus on this line in the introduction to section 3 that says, promoting a human rights-based approach in climate finance requires core components of human rights to guide United Nations Development Cooperation. And this part specifically, it must focus on developing the capacities of both duty bearers to meet their obligations and rights holders to claim their rights. And this is to say essentially that we have to engage the decision makers in the banks and government, as well as those who are trying to access finance or will be affected by the financial deal. So us, right? We are the rights bearers. And so this can be, for example, now I'm going to kind of go into tactics, right? This can be in the form of educational programs. So the Fair Finance School that we as FFCSA host, as well as fact sheets and reports, like really accessible reports that a lot of the organizations present publish. I know IAJ has so many fact sheets on their website as well. And then once rights holders or ourselves are capacitated, we're better equipped to go into these spaces with the duty bearers or the decision makers to actually speak on these issues, right? So that's the first tactic, is these very accessible educational programs that we can host. To get into the specific clusters, cluster 1, as Yasira went over, is the national responsibilities. Here, a tactic could be about holding governments accountable to certain deals, and specifically the calls for accountability and transparency are super important here, and can be backed up by this cluster of principles. The set of principles can also make use of, you can make use of legal processes. In addition to all of the ones mentioned in the toolkit, you can also submit prior requests for documents. You can use legal frameworks to support your demands, and even court cases if that is possible, right? Like you can take a bank to court. And then also, obviously, as part of your own activism, making sure you stay up to date with government institutions, such as the PCC. Then cluster 2 is your obligation to others. So this is our interconnection and our international cooperation, right? So a tactic here could be calling on the South African government or our development finance institutions to stop funding gas exploration in other African countries. And you can do case studies on this or impact reports like we do at Fair Finance. It could also be used, these principles can be used to call on the global north to honor their responsibilities and commitments by giving us grant-based funding. This is a massive call that's coming out of the climate movement at the moment, and there are a number of organizations who work on this. This specific cluster really helps you to form coalitions with international partners. So, for example, the Big Shift Coalition, Fair Finance International, being part of those spaces really helps you to pull on these principles of different obligations and different responsibilities. Then cluster 3, which is maintaining national sovereignty. A tactic here could be actually engaging in policy spaces and calling on the government to have African-led, community-led finance decisions. So public-driven development. Again, here you can use legal frameworks to make demands. You can make parliamentary submissions. You can send open letters and like legal letters to decision makers, which is something that we've done in relation to certain financial deals. So we've sent formal letters to the NDB and the AFDB and the World Bank about their funding of Medupi. And then some organizations we know have called for a moratorium on foreign lending through these formal processes, parliamentary submissions as well. So that's a tactic you can use. Cluster 4 is responsibilities for financial flows. A tactic here could actually be to engage the international lenders and banks, because this cluster is all about how does the money flow into the country and how does it flow out of the country. So what you can do here is make sure that you're engaging with the people who are bringing the money into the country and organize meetings around their annuals to push for more fair financing. So we've done this with the African Development Bank, for example, through a petition and a social media campaign during their annual meetings in May. But then also there's other organizations who have hosted CSO events at the annual meetings, and you can do this for any of the banks, right? Then you've got cluster 5, which is times of crisis. So understanding that it can't be business as usual, right? We're in a climate emergency. Finance can't just function as it always has. So here, one of your calls to action could be loss and damage financing, as mentioned in the previous presentation, or, you know, really calling for the restructuring of the global financial architecture. So this could mean engaging with shareholders of banks. So there are global north countries who sit as shareholders in African development finance institutions. You can and you can engage with them on what kind of the operations of the banks. You can also look at the policies of institutions to see how they operate, especially in times of crisis. So, for example, we do policy assessments, and we go to the, you know, we read all the policies of a specific bank, and we go back to the bank and we say, in the time of a climate crisis, these are the policies you need to implement in order to make sure that your investments are appropriate for the time. So, for example, you need a fossil fuel exclusion plan. And then the last cluster is on procedural fairness, right? So this is really about are the processes leading up to a decision on a financial deal, are those processes accessible, and are they fair? And a call to action here would be obviously about transparency, which is a foundation of most of our work on finance, you know, across organizations. And a tactic here could actually be attending and sitting in annual meetings of financial institutions and raising these issues. So some of them might have space for you to engage on that level where all the shareholders, everyone in the bank is present. And always making sure as campaigners and as NGOs, we are taking communities with us to tell their story in those spaces. A specific call you can make to ensure this principle of procedural fairness is to call on development finance institutions to implement a CSO forum. So some banks already have this, some don't. And us as campaigners, we can go to a bank and say, we would like you to, especially public finance institutions, we'd like you to implement a CSO forum and make sure that they meet with the public about their deals and their investments quarterly, for example. This is something also in the Fair Finance Coalition that we have been doing with the banks that we work on. Obviously, the rest of the toolkit, if you go onto section 4, then you know, really breaks down each cluster. But I really wanted to touch on section 3, and that these clusters, although they are outlined so amazingly in the toolkit, you can also interpret them as a campaigner in your own way. And that's the beauty of using a principled approach to these technical things, is that everyone can use it in an appropriate manner. These are obviously not the only tactics, they're not the only calls to action, but I just wanted to actually just demonstrate how the toolkit can be used in practice. Yeah, so I'll hand over back to the moderating team. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight some of the tactics that have been used.
Thank you for that intervention, Courtney, and for really advocating for a principled approach. I mean, what you've just done is exactly what we hope that the NGOs and campaigners and labor representatives on this call are able to do, which is to make the toolkit something that you can make use of in your practical everyday life. It's so important to really take the toolkit beyond theory and into implementation. And I think that your intervention successfully did that. And we hope that those that are looking to do the same can follow up via a recording, but also most importantly, that they can read the toolkit and come up with their own tactics as well. So up next, we have Barry Matthews, who is representing COSATU, but is also a veteran of NAHAU. It's critical that we have representation in this webinar from the labor constituency, because really we have no concept of the just transition without labor, keeping in mind that the International Labour Organization is the co-founder really of the concept of the just transition. So over to you, Barry. If you can just let us know, what key messages would you like to take away from the toolkit, and how can this be used for policy advocacy?
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon to everyone, colleagues and comrades. To really convey our appreciation on behalf of COSATU. I know I'm wearing two hats now, COSATU, but it's the same thing in essence. For the invite to the launch, incredible, well-developed, extremely well-articulated, easy to understand. Some aspects are quite complex, but really appreciate the work that's gone into it. And I think it's been quite a long road, Dr. Basani Baloy, that we've been traveling this together since COP27, and I think even prior to that. And the assistance from the colleagues on the call, but also specifically IEJ in shaping our understanding subjectively of our JET IP, and it's the broader implications of JET on the continent and our region and on, of course, the developing world. I won't be too long, Chair. I'm going to try stick to 2 or 3 points. The one is just to remind the audience and colleagues and comrades that have joined us on COSATU's principled stance as it relates to climate change and the funding of climate change. Our point has always been, as you mentioned, Chair, in the opening, that wealthy nations ought to fund the transition, as they are largely responsible for the calamitous crisis that we are facing now and in the future. That was our principal point. And I think what this toolkit does, it's been released or launched at a very relevant and important moment in our history. It's a very powerful mechanism to assist workers, organized labor and unorganized, more particularly our communities and society at large, in understanding climate finance and the just transition. And I think the key point we wanted to always elevate is that human rights approach, which thus far has been completely negated from, in our subjective context, JET IP. I think also colleagues and comrades on the platform today will also now know our perspective or our position on JET and JET IP specifically. We had made a submission rejecting JET IP for the very reason that the funding mechanisms were completely and wholly unjust. It was laughable, actually. And we put that forward in a very strong position, and we still continue to do that. And I think other colleagues that had been presenting earlier mentioned this. These massive billion, now trillion-dollar denominated loans that we are getting commitments from the IPG, which is the International Partnership Group, which threaten our national sovereignty in many, many ways, and also the lack of transparency around these commitments and how that can directly impact our society. And in South Africa's context, I know there's other colleagues from different states or different countries. South Africa is, as we know, colleagues and comrades, one of the most, or the most unequal society in the world. So this imposition, and I saw in the chat someone was referring it to as a new form of structural reforms. This imposition of these loans could have a cataclysmic impact on our societies. So the one key point, and I'm very wary of time, Chair, is that we wanted to make use of the toolkit in our structures, whether it's in provinces at national level, in regions, as organized workers, we organize at different levels, even at a local level, to push this aspect of transparency around climate funding. And also use the toolkit specifically towards mobilizing and strengthening our position, that principal position that we made, which might sound idealistic now for wealthy nations to pay for the transition and the damages that have caused, but we're still sticking to that principle. I think I did prepare 20 slides. I can share it with colleagues at a later stage, but I wanted to also elevate and perhaps highlight page 18 of the toolkit, which speaks to our JET IP. And there's a pie chart there that shows sources of committed funding in 2022 vis-a-vis sources of committed funding for 2023. And you can see there's been a slight shift in that funding. It's not very significant. It's still, in our perspective, extremely unjust, again, laughable. But that shift that we see as it relates to concessional loans and grants is a direct result of civil society, IEJ, for example, organized labor, in highlighting the unjust nature of the current funding framework. So I just wanted to make mention of that. It might be quite small shift, but it's proof that within a year, we can actually shift that balance of forces in terms of how this unjust and inequitable funding has come about. And then obviously the aspect of transparency. Three other things that we wanted to mention, brilliantly articulated in the toolkit, are three notions or three issues of action that we can immediately take up. One is for us to better understand this billions to trillions notion, this fixation with neoliberalism and austerity. The second, again, is another fixation with this public-private partnerships. And we've got extensive characterizations and understanding of what this is, using euphemisms such as like unbundling and creating agencies in the context of basically privatization of our public services. And then the last point that I think is, this is the reason why we have this toolkit. And I think it's so important, because when we were struggling as organized labor to have a full comprehension of the kinds of funding that we're going to receive through these concessional loans, these dollar-denominated loans, we were told that, no, that we can't do anything about it because this is a bilateral agreement. So you, labor, must keep quiet. Organized labor, civil society, keep quiet. We know what we're doing. These are high-level bilateral negotiations between powerful nations. But as the toolkit points out, this bilateral investment treaties and the current reform of IMF debt sustainability assessment, these are direct areas, and in Parliament, obviously, that we can start interacting with and mobilizing our constituencies around to change that now very entrenched kind of modus operandi. I'm coming to a close soon. I know I'm speaking quite passionately. I wish I had my slides, but in any case, I'm losing track a little bit. The three recommendations that we wanted to bring to the fore, and these might seem simplistic, but from organized labor, again, standing by our principle in this issue, is that the transition and the financing of the transition must be driven by the people, by workers, communities, and civil society, that we must take ownership of this just transition. I think the chair mentioned before introducing me that just transition is the conception of organized labor. It's our baby, but it's been taken over now. It's been kidnapped. Sorry to use that terrible wording, but it's been taken over now basically by elites. The other issue relates to strengthening transparency, and we can speak for hours around that. But now, especially the launch of this toolkit, now it's going to become extremely important in South Africa's context with the so-called GNU government, in our regional partner space on the African continent, in Latin America. It's going to be extremely important. The last recommendation and principled recommendation maybe that I wanted to mention is that we must always put the interests of our people first. And as COSATU, we had warned the Presidential Climate Commission, we had warned the state, we had warned very numerous bodies of the impacts that the closure of Komati power station would have on that community. And as a result of the closure of Komati, we have a ghost town now with increased unemployment. People are suffering in that area of Mpumalanga, and it's been a travesty. So we're calling for no more Komatis in that respect, and for the pace of the transition to be taken into cognizance about what workers want, what the communities want. The last point, and this is in conclusion, and I think the toolkit speaks very well to this, is linking, and someone said this in the chat group as well, is linking this climate change, the financing, the bureaucracy behind it, with the political dynamics that are at play in our country and the continent and the world at large. So I wanted to ask the question, maybe it's a rhetorical question, but it's something I also need to concretize in my mind, is it possible to have a just transition based on a human rights-based approach in the context of this entrenched neoliberal framework that I think most states now have a fetish or fixation around? That's a key question, I think, that we need to mobilize support around and advocacy. In essence, I think I didn't speak as long as Courtney, but I did manage to get my key points through, Chair. Just to, again, reiterate our appreciation at being invited to this platform and the launch, and the little contributions that we made. And then lastly, to thank IEJ specifically for arming us with the tools, the necessary tools to contest this very critical space. And I hope we can continue to collaborate in the future. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm out of breath. Please excuse me.
Thank you so much for your inputs, Barry. That was very insightful. And I really like that you began by acknowledging the efforts that the IEJ has taken to make that bridge really between CivSoc and labor, and that you demonstrated what can be done if we continue to collaborate. So it is definitely our hope that there will be continued collaboration between CivSoc and labor, specifically around all of the key points that you raised. Highlighting the need for transparency around climate finance, highlighting the need for the pace of the just transition to be in accordance with communities and what is realistic for individuals in mining affected communities. and strengthening transparency once again. These are points that we really think can provide areas for further collaboration. I would like to introduce our third speaker, who is Arnold Nchiko. He is a researcher on climate justice in the East in Southern Africa office at Amnesty International. Arnold, if you would be able to open your camera and please speak to the key messages that you would like to take away from the toolkit and how you think that it can help create advocacy pathways.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I think most has been said by Basani, by Yasira, and by the previous speakers. But maybe for me is to just somehow like emphasize the point that the language of climate change governance, particularly the language of climate finance, has been very inaccessible. It has been very complex. And I think for me, like one of the major message, the major takeaway from the toolkit is actually simplifying that language. So many a times, like climate justice, like movements, particularly the ones are run by young people, have been coming to us for a training that they want to understand climate change in a more human right language, to understand it's very complex, very high level, and this has somehow affected the way they engage climate change governance, both at the African Union level and even at the UN level. Yeah, so for me, I think that is really, really key, particularly the golden thread that runs throughout the toolkit, which is there's this climate finance mechanism. But now key questions are, which particular climate goal is it related to? And how is that like related somehow to human rights? And I think that is very key. Yeah, so for me, I really like look forward to a dissemination plan, if I can put it like that way. But I think because I think this is a so much needed document for advocacy because of that, particularly for many climate justice movement. I was told to speak a bit on obligations of other states, particularly technology transfer. And this is no news to anyone. Technology transfer is as old as climate change governance itself, like since 1992. But maybe like one key takeaway there, usually in advocacy campaigning that we usually do as climate justice organizations, as civil society organizations, we speak to the need for updating, I don't know, nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans. Yeah, and we really like limit ourselves there. And there'll be like this broad statement, environmentally sound technologies have to be transferred to us. But the toolkit actually gives us like a framework or like mechanisms or strategies that are there in existence, but they're really underused. Technology need assessment, technology action plans, those mechanisms, the toolkits like really like highlights them and show how actually we can rely on that and the mechanisms and the frameworks that are in place to give any civil society organization doing advocacy and campaigning on the matter to actually like rely on that with a lot of legitimacy. And this specificity is very critical, particularly where we are at with climate change governance right now. With the Loss and Damage Fund, I think our countries will be expected to speak with so much specificity that we need this much. And how do you get there? And I think having technology need assessment, technology action plans actually like allows you, gives you like a proper framework to somehow like quantify what you might need in terms of technology. And that can be like really critical when one is wants to run a very effective campaign, a very effective advocacy, because you are speaking like really, really specifically. Yeah, but then again, the toolkit also like touches on like the broader political economy that one major issue with tech transfer is we agree there should be there should be like technology transfer in the climate change like space, but then the global financial architecture block actually that. Yeah, it's like what we learned from COVID, vaccines are not being like given to other countries because they're not being transferred. That will kill innovation. And it's the same thing that is happening with technology transfer. But the toolkit does not just mention that, it actually shows that there have been some cases, some best examples where countries have tried to go around this. And there was an example of China. Yeah, techniques like waiting for a particular patent maybe to expire and then for you to see how to proceed from there. but really, I think it provides us really useful guidance in terms of, engaging advocacy campaigning when it comes to technology transfer. And one key thing is like, the technology needs assessment, technology action plans like NDCs and national adaptation plans are to be country specific. But I just wanted to emphasize that when we negotiate in climate change spaces, we usually like negotiate as groups. So again, we have to see how to somehow harmonize or to make like the group that we are, like the Africa group, to go and speak somehow compellingly on technology action plans, like the needs that we have, because we won't be speaking like South Africa or DRC or Somalia, we'll be speaking as a group. So it's just for us as civil society groups also in our like campaigning to just try to come up with like useful strategies of somehow influencing like the whole group at once. To speak on sustainable market bonds, and I think that has been really covered, and I think comprehensively so, particularly on the insistence that the climate goal that we are after, to be clear, and human rights have to also be like promoted when it comes to this bond. And that brings in the questions that other speakers have been talking about, transparency, participation, and I think that is really clear. Yeah, but for me, particularly in my role, I think we were thinking of like devising, a whole human rights education like program to just try to simplify like the complexities that we have out there in climate change governance generally and climate change finance also. I think like the toolkit has done work for many organizations, and I'm just really like looking forward to like a proper dissemination plan, so that we make sure that it really like reaches those who are in need of it the most. And it's great, like the organizations that took place that participated in the development of the toolkit, like CAN International, for example, can really like fast track that process of like disseminating the toolkits to really to the broader climate justice movement, particularly those who are still like struggling with the complex language in which climate change governance, climate finance is framed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Arnold and Wanchiko. I really appreciate that your last input spoke to the need for a strengthened dissemination plan regarding this toolkit, because absolutely it would be a waste if we don't manage to successfully make this toolkit available and accessible to those that need it the most. And definitely this is something that we are considering as SA CAN, but also in collaboration with CAN International that are on this call today. The points that you raised around the way that the toolkit actually provides a political economy analysis of climate finance, specifically in the context of the technology transfer, are so critical, because that is a great way of seeing that particular chapter, an element of the toolkit. And we do definitely share your sentiments with the need for us to make the language less complex. This is how we lose people in climate finance. And it's such an important topic that it's unfortunate that we, as civil society, we haven't quite gotten there yet. The how do we make this easy for people to digest? But we will get there. And this toolkit is a great step towards that journey. Next, we will be having our final and last panelist, Nkateko Chauke, who is the program director of Oxfam South Africa. She'll be giving her intervention focusing on Principle Cluster 2, responsibility to others. And this actually aligns with the work that Oxfam is currently undergoing. They have a proposal on climate debt and reparations to secure an ambitious finance goal that is gender transformative and responsive. Over to you, Nkateko.
Thank you so much, Mo. And I just want to kick off by thanking especially the project team who really pulled us together to developing this outstanding piece of work. I'm very humbled and encouraged by the words that were shared earlier by Barry to say, you've given us essentially a tool to go out there and advocate for really unlocking much needed finance. So to start off my reflections, I just want to locate this work into Oxfam's work, where we focus on advancing a just, equal, and feminist transition. And in our view is that we argue that a feminist transition ensures the protection of human rights of all individuals, groups, and people impacted by the climate crisis, especially women, girls, and the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. This is premised on the fact that much greater equality is the foundation without which we cannot beat the climate breakdown. So equality is at the heart of our work. And at the same time, we call for responses to the climate crisis to focus on reducing equality rather than making it worse. This transition at its heart must be decolonial, gender just, and primarily benefit those who contribute the least to the climate crisis, as the people who are on the front lines of the work that we do. So decoloniality is also at the heart of our messaging, recognizing the imbalance between scales in the North and the global South as it relates to the movement of money required to tackle this crisis. Now, what does this mean for the principle of obligations to others, in essence? And really, this toolkit gives us a full-on understanding of what are the key principles that we should be looking at, what brings us to where we are now. And it rests on 4 key aspects. One is the duty of international cooperation, where states are really responsible for cooperating or working with each other to achieve certain goals and in alignment with sustainable development goals. That is to ensure that in advancing developments, human rights and fundamental freedoms are secured. The second aspect looks at extraterritorial obligations. That is, countries in the developing world who are unable to really unlock the much needed revenue can seek foreign assistance in terms of international financing to really meet their human rights obligations. So that's where you see developing countries going out to get ODA funding, negotiating debt and loans, and as we see increasingly with the climate finance structures, which lie heavily on the loan agreements as opposed to grants, which are much needed by developing countries. The third aspect looks at the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. This looks at really understanding that not all the countries are historically responsible for the catastrophic events that we see around climate change as is. And with that, those who least contribute to the crisis have the right to actually embed or invoke accountability on the parts of the world who have really contributed to this crisis. So in essence, climate action measures of that developed countries really need to finance this. And this is where we locate our narrative around reparations, that we also need to shift the narrative in terms of how we look at climate finance to trigger that responsibility in terms of the global North really paying its dues to the global South. And this is underpinned by Oxfam's campaigns, which look at making rich polluters pay, as well as taxing the rich to really broaden the tax base and unlock much needed resources. The fourth aspect, which the toolkit really hones into, looks at technological transfer. Now, the toolkit hones into this aspect because it really unlocks the other 3 that I have just explained. In essence, states really have the responsibility to develop and enhance mechanisms that facilitate environmentally sound technologies to be transferred to countries who really need them most. So within this context, this gives us a framework in which to really understand how power dynamics lie, but also in terms of interrogating South Africa's JET IP and seeing and recognizing the shortfalls that it presents. Now, I also want to lay the context in which we find ourselves in terms of the international climate finance architecture and subsequently the implications of where we find ourselves now. So in essence, developed countries have reported, and this is located from the Oxfam research or Oxfam Climate Shadow report that shows us really just the shortfalls in terms of promises and pronouncements that have been made in terms of developed countries having recorded 83.3 billion of climate finance, which falls far short of the promise that was made of 100 billion year-on-year contribution. Secondly, is that the net financial value of committed climate finance, which is the grant equivalent of climate finance, is less than what is actually reported by developed countries. Again, we see that there's a skewing and a blurring of the lines when it comes to reporting climate finance. Thirdly, is that 1/4 of public finance is committed as grants. This is a reminder to us that literally most of it is loans, and most of those loans are not even concessional. The fourth point I want to make is that looking at how climate finance is distributed, you see that 33% of climate finance is allocated to adaptation and 59% to mitigation. Now, back in Glasgow, COP26, we made a commitment as a global community to the 50-50 club, which was a real scenario that we were grappling with to ensure that climate finance is allocated and balanced on a 50-50 scale. To date, we have not seen this yet. Only 2.9% of related climate finance is identified gender equality as a principal objective. However, there's not enough data to actually back this up. So, and to trace the line of where that money is spent specifically. For us, this is a key advocacy point, and the toolkit really helps us grapple with such issues in terms of how do we trace the money? How do we look at how money is spent as it relates to this? Oxfam is pushing to move beyond this 100 billion a year commitment goal, but to tap into other revenue sources that help us mobilize climate. The toolkit again focuses on how wealth tax and taxation can really close the implications that we are realizing now, which include the increased debt burden, which is introduced by the billions to trillions agenda that we're seeing now. Countries in the global south are increasingly dealing with a debt burden escalated by a myriad of things, including just how, as mentioned by Barry, that we are grappling with a neoliberal financial architecture as we see it. Secondly, is that conditionalities on loans have severe implications for service delivery, and that's realizing really human rights, right? We haven't strengthened our capacity to really negotiate these conditionalities as we get these loans. And this is one aspect that the toolkit helps us look at how we deal with development finance institutions. Furthermore, historical and current injustices perpetuated by the global north on the global south show that essentially the scales are creating more inequality, poverty, and ultimately exacerbating the climate crisis. And sadly, and most unfortunate, is realizing that the common but differentiated responsibility principle has not been fully realized as we unpack these issues. This is because, as mentioned earlier in Basani's iteration, that the intent to de-risk private finance in the JET-IP could block the technological advancements that we need as South Africa, but also as developing countries in the global south. So the power dynamics here are skewed because the financiers bringing in the money have the power to dictate how this money is used. I'll make an example with how we're seeing ourselves locked in market-centric models in South Africa, where we're really not capitalizing on broadening our value chains. So we see PE as the industrial hub of the country. Port Elizabeth produces or really combines or puts together, assembles, that's the word I'm looking for. VW in Port Elizabeth assembles parts for Volkswagen, whereas we are not capitalizing on the potential that we could play in terms of broadening our industrialization capacity and also building our skill in terms of building the vehicles here, and therefore making more value in the kinds of revenues and investments that we are attracting. And so there's a real need for us as South Africa to look at how do we broaden our value chains to capitalize on the kind of investments that we attract, but also in terms of how we bolster our export market and engagement in the economy. And so this really lies on the bedrock that we need to be cognizant of the changing technological rules as we see them as well, because this could potentially have an impact in terms of how we structure these deals. The toolkit also shows us that we have limitations as per the JET IP in two strands. One is around skills development, and the second is around how it's highly concentrated on economic diversification projects. Now, Oxfam's research, particularly on our JP scoping work, highlighted that South Africa alone needs at least 2.65 billion in the next 4 years enable to us to reach our goals for reskilling the economy, to meet our goals on reducing emissions and unlocking renewable energy. Failing which, our economy cannot cope with the technological rules, as I've mentioned, but also cannot produce the kind of jobs and sustainable livelihoods that we require to truly see a feminist, just, and equitable transition. Now, what are the key considerations that we want to put on the table? Is that through our campaigns on Make Polluters Pay and Tax the Rich, and in alignment with the information that this toolkit puts to us, is that we've realized that governments can raise trillions of dollars a year by taxing the wealth and income of the super rich and of corporate profits. In rich OECD countries in particular, a wealth tax alone could raise up to $1.2 trillion a year. While we have set the ask and the standard, and we know that the need is at least 6 trillion, is that unlocking these revenue sources could help us as well advance our ambition towards reaching our emissions reductions goal. Secondly, is that Oxfam and ActionAid's analysis has shown that a tax of 50 to 90% on the windfall profits of 722 mega corporations could generate up to 941 billion a year. So it's a call again from us to say, we in essence need to follow the money. We in essence need to really trigger the responsibility, particularly when we speak about common but differentiated responsibility, to bring new kinds of technology and finance it based on the revenues that sit in the global north. In terms of financial innovations that we need, we maintain that this is an essential aspect of our work. At state level, these are critical for improving access and essentially building competitive advantage. And I go back to the example that I made about, VW in PE only playing an assembly role instead of a manufacturing role. Yes,
so sorry.
this
Thank
is
you so
my
much for
last point.
Yes, we do have to manage time. Yes.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I went over time, Mo, but thank you for the opportunity. But I just wanted to make one point on how we as civil society could really capitalize on this toolkit. And it's really unlocking the social accountability mechanisms that we ought to be putting forward, especially as presented by our policies. I mean, the newly published climate change bill also gives us leeway to connect the dots in terms of how we unlock social accountability mechanisms, as also emphasized in the toolkit as well. Thank you once again for your time, and apologies for going over time.
Thank you for that, Nkateko. It was incredibly valuable, and we do wish that we wouldn't have to cut you off, because what you were saying was very important, and everything that you mentioned about taxing the rich and the need for historical responsibility, particularly in reframing reparations as a climate finance challenge rather than initiative, is exactly what we would like people to get thinking about, and for civil society to mobilize around as well. So thank you for highlighting how obligations to others is fundamentally a human rights challenge. Amongst everything, it can have multiple elements, but it is a rights-based issue. So we have run over time by 15 minutes. We do have 3 or so questions, and I had messaged them to the panelists. So please let us know if you would be able to answer the first question. But before we head into that, I just want to let everybody know that Basani will have to leave. So maybe I can give Basani 1 minute to say goodbye to everyone.
No, I'm going to stay. I've told the others that they must just wait.
Okay.
My other meeting. Continue.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, so the last question that I had seen was a question about how exactly can we use this toolkit in our advocacy for ambitious climate action ahead of COP29 in Baku in over just 60 days?
I think there are a number of ways you could use it, but it all depends on what particular aspect that you want to advocate on, right? And some of the aspects are at multiple levels. So at the national level, if you are a country, for instance, that is not, I would say, a country that is not engaged, for instance, in this whole climate budgeting process, right, where your government is actually not pursuing this as a mechanism. And why would you want your government to pursue it? Because you are receiving money in terms of all these flows in terms of climate finance, but you have no way of understanding, is this money actually new money or is it old money? And that has been repackaged. You have no way of understanding whether or not what you are receiving as climate finance, for instance, is actually being costed to the needs of your country, right? In terms of what the just transition actually costs, right? And so having such a climate responsive budget process that helps for us to cost this thing becomes quite key, and to create certain levels of transparency. So that is something that is at the national level. I think at the more international level, the toolkit, for instance, talks about points to various ways in which the global financial architecture needs to be reformed so that it's responsive to the issue of climate change and also issues of the just transition. So that those are particular avenues. I mean, it's quite comprehensive. There are different types of aspects that we cover. And I loved hearing from the panelists about what else we can actually cover. So we need to see this as a living document as well. But yeah, I hope that clarifies that.
Thank you, Basani, for that. And then we had quite a few questions about the upcoming toolkit trainings. And the last one was about whether or not representatives of government are welcome to attend the toolkit trainings. So I'm not sure if you and Yasir would perhaps like to take this time just to give an overview of the toolkit trainings and who is invited, who can they reach out to from the team, and what they can expect from the toolkit trainings.
Shall I take that, Yasira?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So in terms of the toolkit training, the primary audience for the initial toolkit training is for civil society and trade unions, right? But it doesn't mean we are not closing the space for that. We want to obviously engage the broader body politic, right? Parliament is another space that we would like to engage, and also other like government entities as well. And so we are trying to mobilize the funding for that because it does come at a cost. So we want to, and so we will open the space up. And this is the encouragement that we are getting from our colleagues to say, give us a dissemination plan that also covers these other trainings. And so that is going to be rolled out. The first training is going to take place in Joburg at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation on the 20th and the 21st of August. So that's next week. And then the second training is going to take place at the Solidarity Center at the AIDC on the 28th and 29th of August. So that's the following week. What we can do is that we will send everyone on this call the training information or emails, because I think we have your emails, and we'll just send that out for you. And so you can, there's a Google form that you need to fill in for the trainings, and then yes, and then we can proceed. But just to say, government and parliament is not, we are not excluding, it's just that it's for a later date. We are first starting with civil society and trade unions for these particular trainings. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Basani. Yasira, are you covered, or do you have any comments as well?
No, I think Basani covered everything.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. And on the particular aspect of the dissemination plan, I would just encourage everybody who is interested in collaborating on that particular element to please leave your details in the chat so that we can follow up with you. So the next question is, how does the toolkit address the dichotomy of the politics behind not waiting for international climate finance, but obviously raising national domestic finance for climate action? Would any of our panelists like to take this? Sorry to cut you off, Basani.
No, I'm happy for anyone else to take it, but I'm just in the interest of time. I did answer this question in the chat.
Oh,
and
okay.
we spoke about how we have we use monetary policy, green monetary policy financing instruments as a way of mobilizing domestic resources. So for those of you who are thinking, so there is this idea of like ensuring that the polluter pays, and ensuring that holding global north countries accountable. For those of you who sees the opportunity for mobilizing domestic resources, the way in which you could do that is through using monetary policy instruments, which would broaden the mandate of the Reserve Bank, which currently has a very narrow mandate that focuses on inflation targeting and financial stability, leaving out the broader mandate of climate, as well as structural transformation and employment, and ensuring full employment. So there are tools that can be used. So we discussed that in the.
Thank you for that, Basani. And do we have any insight on toolkits related to community-based climate financing in South Africa? Does anybody want to take this question? Otherwise, I can provide just a brief response. Okay. I think we'd just like to clarify that the main target audience for this particular toolkit were trade unions and civil society organizations, recognizing that the needs of community-based organizations are quite different from CSOs, although they do form all one big group of civil society. And so at this moment in time, the toolkit does not necessarily speak to CBOs, but can be used as a resource for CBOs. Barry, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, Chair, sorry, very, very quickly. I just wanted to I had to put my jacket on. Cape Town's very cold. I just wanted to recommend, I mean, the toolkit's now launched. So I think from our constituency, well, from my constituency, we have a responsibility now to properly comprehend the content, but also to disseminate it amongst our structures, whether that's workers or communities. I think that would be just the point. It speaks exactly to the issues that have been raised in Mpumalanga communities to us. So it's a brilliant toolkit for both communities, NGOs, civil society, and organized labor. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you for that, Barry. That is duly noted. Do we have any questions or comments? Okay, it seems that we have no remaining questions and that we have sufficiently answered all of the questions that you may have had during the process of the webinar. Then I'll be happy to just hand over perhaps to Basani for a brief closing and just a reminder of the next steps.
Thank you all, and sorry for keeping you all. And I understand you guys are having to rush for other things. But just to thank everyone on this call for joining us, and to thank our panelists as well, to thank our reference group and those like the New Economy Hub that have supported this particular work. We are looking forward to seeing you all in the trainings that we are going to be holding. We are going to obviously be disseminating this toolkit more. We will keep reference of everyone's email and just keep you in touch in terms of the work that is going to be done. And thanks to COSATU and others and Oxfam for also saying that they want to be part of this dissemination. And yeah, and looking forward to seeing you on the ground in our Mzabalazo. Amandla, comrades.